For nearly 5,000 years, a small white puff growing on a scraggly bush has decided the fate of empires, filled the pockets of kings, and chained millions of human beings to a life of forced labor. It has clothed pharaohs and paupers, powered the first factories of the modern age, and quietly financed wars that reshaped continents. Most people wear it every single day without ever wondering where it came from or what it truly cost. This is the story of cotton, the plant the world once called white gold. Picture a single seed pod splitting open in the sun, revealing fibers so fine they look almost woven by nature itself before a single human hand ever touches them. It seems unassuming, even fragile, and yet this small burst of fiber would eventually help decide which nations grew wealthy and which grew desperate, which cities rose into industrial giants, and which economies were built quite literally on the backs of the enslaved. Few materials in human history have been so intimately tangled up with both extraordinary innovation and extraordinary cruelty at the very same time. Long before anyone wrote the word cotton in any language, farmers in the Indus Valley were already coaxing it from the soil. Archaeologists digging through the ruins of Mehrgarh in what is now Pakistan found cotton fibers dating back roughly 7,000 years, evidence of one of the earliest known relationships between humans and this plant. Around the same era, on the opposite side of the planet, people in Peru were independently domesticating their own wild cotton species, twisting it into fishing nets and simple cloth. Two civilizations, separated by oceans and unaware of each other's existence, had stumbled onto the same discovery, that this fluffy fiber could be spun into thread, and thread could be woven into something no animal hide or tree bark could match. Cloth that was light, breathable, and soft against the skin. It was in the Indus Valley, though, that cotton truly found its first great civilization. The people of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa built one of the most sophisticated urban cultures of the ancient world, complete with planned streets, advanced drainage systems, and standardized weights for trade, and cotton became one of its quiet triumphs. Threads recovered from these sites show a level of spinning skill that would not have felt out of place 1,000 years later. While Egypt was busy weaving linen from flax, and China was cultivating silk behind closed doors, guarding the secret of its production as a closely held state treasure, South Asia was perfecting the art of cotton, and it would maintain a form of global supremacy in this craft for thousands of years to come. There was something almost paradoxical about cotton's rise in this region. Unlike silk, which required an entire hidden ecosystem of mulberry trees and carefully tended silkworms, or linen, which demanded a labor-intensive process of retting and beating flax stalks, cotton grew almost defiantly in the open, visible to anyone who cared to look. Its secret was never really a secret at all. What separated a mediocre cotton cloth from an extraordinary one was not access to some hidden resource, but generations of accumulated human skill, passed quietly from hand to hand, refined a little further with each passing decade. That distinction would matter enormously later, when the question of who controlled cotton's finishing process, rather than who controlled the raw plant itself, became the real prize nations fought over. By the time the Greeks and Romans began encountering cotton cloth from India, they treated it as something almost magical. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote of trees in India that seemed to grow wool instead of fruit, a description that captures just how baffling this plant appeared to outsiders who had never seen anything like it. Alexander the Great's soldiers, marching through the Indian subcontinent in the 4th century before the Common Era, reportedly marveled at garments finer and lighter than anything they had seen in the Mediterranean world, cloth that seemed to breathe in the heat rather than trap it against the skin. Roman senators eventually wore cotton imported at extraordinary expense, a fabric so associated with luxury that it became something of a status symbol among the empire's elite. In certain periods, Roman lawmakers grew so alarmed by the flow of silver, leaving the empire to pay for Eastern imports like cotton, silk, and spices, that they attempted to restrict the trade outright, fearing it was quietly draining Rome's wealth into foreign hands. The attempts largely failed. Desire for the fabric proved stronger than any law written to contain it, a pattern that would repeat itself again and again throughout cotton's long history, as governments discovered that regulating human appetite for fine cloth was far easier to legislate than to actually enforce. That eastward flow of silver in exchange for cotton, spices and silk was not a passing curiosity. It was one of the engines driving the earliest truly global trade networks. Ports along India's western coast, and later along the Arabian Peninsula, became bustling exchange points where cotton textiles moved outward in every direction, carried by monsoon winds, camel caravans, and the patient rhythms of merchant fleets. Long before anyone had drawn a map of the so-called Silk Road, cotton was already tracing its own invisible lines across the ancient world, threading together India, Persia, Arabia, East Africa, and eventually the Mediterranean. In India itself, cotton wove itself into something deeper than commerce. It became art. Weavers in Bengal developed a fabric so fine it was said a piece large enough to make a full garment could be pulled through a small ring, earning it poetic nicknames across the centuries like woven air and evening dew, names that hint at just how impossibly delicate this cloth appeared to those who saw it for the first time. This muslin, prized across empires from Rome to the Mughal court, represented generations of accumulated skill passed from parent to child, thread by thread, in villages whose names rarely appear in history books, but whose work traveled farther than any of them ever would. The process behind this legendary cloth was almost unimaginably demanding. Certain rare varieties of cotton, grown only along the banks of specific rivers in Bengal, produced fibers so delicate that spinning them required extraordinary humidity, steady hands, and often the particular touch of young women whose fingers were considered sensitive enough for the finest threads. A single piece of the very best muslin could take months to complete, involving dozens of separate hands across spinning, dyeing, and weaving. For centuries, if a person anywhere from Baghdad to Byzantium wanted the finest cloth money could buy, the answer usually began and ended in India, a reputation that would later make Bengal's textile industry one of the most coveted prizes for European colonial ambition. As Islam spread across the Middle East, North Africa, and eventually into parts of Europe beginning in the 7th century, it carried cotton cultivation and cotton commerce along with it. Arab traders and scholars refined irrigation techniques that allowed cotton to be grown in regions once considered too arid, expanding its reach into Egypt, Persia, and parts of Spain. The very word cotton likely traces back to the Arabic kutin, a linguistic fingerprint of just how central Arab merchants and agriculturalists were in carrying this plant westward. Andalusian Spain under Muslim rule became one of the first parts of Europe where cotton was cultivated on any meaningful scale, centuries before most of the continent would even see the raw plant. For much of the medieval period, Europe remained largely a consumer of cotton rather than a producer. The cold, wet climate across most of the continent made cultivation difficult, so European merchants instead built fortunes buying raw cotton and finished cloth from the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern markets, then redistributing it further north. Italian city-states, especially Venice and Genoa, grew wealthy in part by acting as the connective tissue between Eastern cotton producers and European buyers hungry for lighter, more comfortable fabrics than the coarse wool they had relied on for generations. German merchant cities along the Rhine, and later the emerging textile towns of Flanders, joined this trade as well, blending imported cotton with linen to produce a hybrid fabric called fustian, a clever workaround for a continent that could buy the fiber but could not yet grow it in any serious quantity. And yet, quietly in the background of all this trade, something else was happening. European merchants and travelers were taking careful note of exactly how India processed raw cotton bolls into finished cloth, a process that still relied heavily on human hands and simple tools. Removing seeds from raw cotton fiber was brutally slow work. One worker might spend an entire day separating fiber from seed for barely a pound of usable cotton, and spinning that fiber into usable thread required patience measured in months, not days. For thousands of years, this bottleneck limited how much cotton cloth the world could actually produce, no matter how much raw cotton grew in the fields. Demand for cotton cloth across the known world had always outpaced the human capacity to actually make it. That bottleneck was about to become the single most consequential problem in the history of global manufacturing, and the race to solve it would end up reshaping continents. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, an entirely separate cotton story was unfolding, one that had nothing to do with India, Egypt, or the Mediterranean at all. Indigenous peoples throughout Mesoamerica and South America had been cultivating their own cotton varieties for millennia, weaving textiles that carried deep cultural and religious meaning. In Aztec society, cotton cloth functioned almost like currency, used to pay tribute to rulers and to mark rank and status so precisely that certain patterns and colors were legally reserved for nobility alone, forbidden to commoners on pain of punishment. The Maya wove cotton into elaborate ceremonial garments believed to carry spiritual significance, connecting the wearer to gods and ancestors. Warriors across these civilizations also discovered a more practical use for the fiber. Thickly quilted cotton armor, soaked in salt brine to harden it, proved surprisingly effective at stopping arrows and blades, light enough to allow freedom of movement in the heat of battle, unlike the heavy metal armor European soldiers wore. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century, some described genuine surprise at how well this cotton armor performed, several eventually adopting it themselves in place of their own steel. These societies had their own long, independent cotton traditions, stretching back further than most of European history itself, entirely unaware that on the other side of the world, another civilization along the Indus River had discovered the very same plant thousands of years earlier. The collision of these worlds, European, African, and American, would soon reshape cotton's story into something far darker. As European colonial powers established plantations across the Caribbean and the Americas, they discovered that certain climates, particularly in the American South, were extraordinarily well suited to growing cotton at scale. The problem was labor. Cotton at this stage of history still required enormous manual effort, from planting and tending to the excruciatingly slow process of separating fiber from seed. European colonizers, driven by profit and unrestrained by any moral limits they respected, turned to the transatlantic slave trade to solve what they saw as a labor shortage. Beginning in the 16th century and accelerating brutally over the next 300 years, millions of enslaved Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic in what became known as the Middle Passage, a voyage so horrific that a significant percentage of those forced aboard did not survive to see land on the other side. Many of the survivors were destined for plantations that would eventually grow cotton, sugar, tobacco, and rice. The suffering inflicted on these individuals is almost impossible to fully convey. Families were torn apart, cultures violently suppressed, languages forbidden, and generations of human beings were reduced to property under a system designed purely to extract wealth from their forced labor. Wealth that would flow upward into the hands of planters, shipping magnates, and eventually industrialists an ocean away. Cotton, more than almost any other single commodity, would become deeply and permanently entangled with this history. Early on, however, cotton actually played a smaller role in American slavery than crops like tobacco and rice, simply because separating cotton fiber from its stubborn seeds by hand was so slow that growing it at scale remained impractical. That single technical limitation, more than any moral hesitation, kept cotton on the margins of the American economy for generations. All of that was about to change once a small mechanical invention removed the last major obstacle standing between raw cotton fields and mass production, and in doing so, tragically expanded rather than reduced the demand for enslaved labor. That invention arrived in 1793 when a young inventor named Eli Whitney built a simple device that could separate cotton fiber from its seeds far faster than any human hand ever could. The cotton gin, as it came to be known, transformed cotton from a labor-limited crop into something that could, in theory, be produced almost without limit. Whitney likely imagined his invention would reduce the need for enslaved labor. The opposite happened. As demand for raw cotton exploded, particularly from hungry textile mills across the Atlantic in Britain, plantation owners across the American South expanded their operations dramatically, and with that expansion came an even greater demand for enslaved labor to plant and harvest the crop feeding those newly efficient gins. Within just a few decades, cotton became the dominant crop of the American South and one of the most valuable commodities in the entire global economy. Plantation owners, chasing ever greater profits, pushed cotton cultivation aggressively westward into Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Land seized from indigenous nations through forced removal policies that displaced entire peoples to make room for the crop. By the eve of the American Civil War, cotton accounted for more than half of all United States exports, and the phrase "cotton is king" was spoken not as poetry, but as plain economic fact, repeated by politicians and planters as though it were an unquestionable law of nature, rather than a system built entirely on human suffering. Entire regional economies, along with the immense wealth of a small planter class, rested on the backs of enslaved men, women, and children forced to work fields under conditions of extraordinary brutality, driven by quotas, violence, and constant surveillance to pick more cotton than the day before. This wealth did not stay contained within the American South. It flowed northward into shipping, banking, and insurance industries centered in cities like New York, and it flowed across the Atlantic into the mills of Britain, weaving the economies of two continents together through a supply chain built on human bondage. By some later estimates, cotton grown by enslaved labor represented one of the largest sources of capital in the entire 19th century world economy. Capital that helped fund railroads, universities, and financial institutions whose ties to slavery would take generations to even begin to be acknowledged. Britain, in fact, had its own cotton revolution unfolding in parallel, one that would come to define an entirely new era of human history. Throughout the 18th century, British inventors chased solutions to that ancient bottleneck of spinning thread quickly enough to keep pace with growing demand. James Hargreaves introduced the spinning jenny in the 1760s, allowing a single worker to spin multiple threads simultaneously. Richard Arkwright followed with the water frame, a machine powerful enough to require dedicated buildings and water-driven machinery to operate, effectively inventing the modern factory system in the process. Samuel Crompton later combined ideas from both machines into the spinning mule, producing thread of remarkable strength and fineness. Each invention built upon the last, and together they solved, almost overnight by historical standards, a production problem that had constrained cotton cloth manufacturing for thousands of years. The English city of Manchester, once a modest market town, transformed into the epicenter of this new industrial world, earning the nickname Cottonopolis. Its skyline filled with brick chimneys, pouring smoke into the sky as steam-powered mills, first driven by water and later by coal-fired engines, ran day and night, their machinery never resting even as the workers tending them desperately needed to. Visitors from across Europe traveled to Manchester specifically to witness this new kind of city, one built not around a cathedral or a royal palace, but around rows of factories, an arrangement so unprecedented that it seemed to announce the arrival of an entirely new era in human civilization. Workers, including large numbers of women and children as young as 6 or 7, labored in conditions that were loud, dangerous, and relentless, often for 14 or more hours a day, breathing cotton dust that would damage their lungs over years of exposure, standing beside machinery that could maim or kill in an instant of distraction. Child labor reformers eventually documented conditions so severe that they helped spark some of the earliest factory safety laws in British history, though meaningful change came slowly and unevenly. The wealth generated by these mills helped finance Britain's rise as the world's dominant industrial and imperial power throughout the 19th century, while the raw material feeding those mills arrived largely from enslaved labor across the Atlantic, and increasingly, as the century progressed, from colonized cotton-growing regions in India and Egypt as well, regions Britain now controlled directly and could shape to serve its own industrial appetite. This created a strange and troubling irony, one that would echo for more than a century. India, the very civilization that had perfected cotton, spinning and weaving for thousands of years, found itself under British colonial rule, reduced primarily to a supplier of raw cotton, while British mills claimed the profitable business of turning that raw material into finished cloth, some of which was then shipped right back and sold in Indian markets, often undercutting the very artisans whose ancestors had invented the craft in the first place. Traditional Indian weavers, whose ancestors had clothed emperors and inspired Roman senators to write and wonder, found their livelihoods devastated as machine-made British cotton, produced faster and cheaper than any human hand could match, flooded local markets throughout the 19th century. Entire weaving communities in Bengal, once celebrated across continents for producing the finest muslin the world had ever seen, fell into poverty within a generation or two, their traditional skills suddenly rendered commercially unviable in the face of industrial competition backed by an occupying colonial power. This economic imbalance would later become a powerful symbol in India's independence movement in the 20th century, when leaders like Mahatma Gandhi urged Indians to spin their own cotton by hand once again, using the simple spinning wheel, or charkha, as both a practical tool and a potent political statement against colonial exploitation. The image of Gandhi seated quietly at his spinning wheel became one of the most enduring symbols of the entire independence struggle, a deliberate act of reclaiming a craft that colonization had tried to strip away. Back across the Atlantic, cotton's grip on the American economy tightened right up until the moment it helped tear the nation apart. Tensions over the expansion of slavery into new territories, driven in large part by the insatiable demand for more cotton-producing land, became one of the central fault lines leading to the American Civil War. When war finally broke out in 1861, cotton itself became a weapon of diplomacy rather than just a commodity of trade. The Confederacy, confident that Britain's textile mills could not survive without a steady flow of Southern cotton, deliberately withheld shipments early in the war, gambling that European economic desperation would force Britain and France to intervene militarily on the South's behalf. The strategy, which historians now refer to as cotton diplomacy, largely failed, and the reasons why revealed just how far Britain's cotton empire had already spread beyond American shores. Anticipating exactly this kind of disruption, British merchants had already begun diversifying their cotton supply from India and Egypt in the years before the war. And although the sudden loss of Southern cotton did trigger real hardship in Manchester, including a period so severe it became known as the Lancashire Cotton Famine, it never became severe enough to force British intervention. Confederate hopes for foreign rescue never materialized in the way its leaders had gambled, and the South found itself fighting alone, propped up by a crop that, in the end, could not save the cause it had helped create. The end of the Civil War brought the legal end of slavery in the United States, but it did not bring an end to the exploitation embedded within cotton's story. Many formerly enslaved people found themselves trapped in new systems of sharecropping, technically free but economically bound to the very same land and often the very same families that had once enslaved them. Cotton remained the backbone of the Southern economy for generations, and the deep social and racial inequalities it had helped create would continue to shape American life long after the last bale had been picked by hand. As the 20th century unfolded, cotton continued its transformation, this time through mechanization rather than manpower. The mechanical cotton picker, patented decades earlier, but not widely and reliably adopted until the middle of the century, finally replaced the backbreaking hand labor that had defined cotton harvesting for generations. A single mechanical picker could do the work of dozens of field hands in a fraction of the time, a leap in efficiency that would have seemed unimaginable to the enslaved men and women who had once picked the same fields by hand under threat of the whip. This shift triggered massive social upheaval of its own. As mechanization reduced the need for manual cotton harvesting, and as Black Americans continued facing brutal discrimination, segregation, and racial violence across the South, millions made the difficult decision to leave the land their families had worked for generations. This mass movement, known as the Great Migration, carried roughly 6 million Black Americans north and west between the early 20th century and the 1970s, reshaping the demographic and cultural landscape of cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York, and fueling entirely new chapters in American music, art, and political life that grew directly out of communities uprooted, in no small part, by cotton's changing relationship with human labor. Around the same time, cotton was also facing a new kind of rival, one that grew not in fields under the sun, but inside chemical laboratories. Chemists in the early and mid-20th century developed synthetic fibers like rayon, nylon, and later polyester, materials engineered from petroleum byproducts rather than harvested from any living plant. Nylon in particular, unveiled by DuPont in the late 1930s, was marketed with almost breathless excitement as a fiber stronger than steel, yet finer than a spider's web, and it quickly found its way into everything from stockings to parachutes during the Second World War. For the first time in human history, cotton's dominance over the world's clothing was genuinely challenged by something entirely new, something that did not depend on weather, soil quality, or harvest seasons at all. Textile industries around the world began blending natural and synthetic fibers to capture the advantages of both, and the humble cotton plant once treated as almost magical by ancient Greek historians who had never seen anything like it, now had to compete on price and performance against materials that never needed sunlight, rainfall, or a single acre of farmland to exist. Yet cotton refused to fade into irrelevance. Its natural breathability, softness, and comfort against human skin proved difficult to fully replicate, and global demand for cotton textiles continued climbing throughout the late 20th century and into the 21st. Today, cotton is cultivated across more than 80 countries, spanning nearly every continent capable of supporting its growth. China, India, and the United States now rank among the largest producers in the world, alongside significant cultivation in Pakistan, Brazil, and parts of Central Asia. The crop that once relied entirely on human hands for spinning and weaving is now processed largely by advanced machinery, capable of transforming raw fiber into finished fabric at speeds no 18th century inventor could have imagined. Modern cotton production, however, carries its own complicated legacy. Vast quantities of water are required to grow the crop, and cotton farming in water-stressed regions has contributed to serious environmental strain. Most famously in the case of the Aral Sea in Central Asia, once one of the largest lakes on Earth, now reduced to a fraction of its former size largely due to decades of Soviet-era irrigation diverted for cotton cultivation. Labor concerns have also persisted into the present day, with international attention repeatedly drawn to forced labor practices in certain cotton-growing regions, a painful echo of the exploitation that has shadowed this crop since its earliest large-scale cultivation. Scientists have continued shaping cotton's future as well, developing genetically modified varieties resistant to pests and disease, aiming to increase yields while reducing the need for chemical pesticides. Organic and sustainably farmed cotton has also grown into its own market niche, as consumers increasingly ask not just how their clothing feels, but where it came from and who grew it. In many ways, this renewed attention to cotton's origins mirrors questions people have been asking in different forms for thousands of years, tracing all the way back to Roman senators wondering how India produced cloth so fine it seemed to defy explanation. Today, if you glance down at whatever you happen to be wearing, there is a reasonable chance some part of it began as a small white fiber growing on a plant, harvested by machine or by hand, spun and woven through a supply chain stretching across multiple countries and continents. That simple piece of clothing carries within it an extraordinary weight of history. Ancient civilizations independently discovering the same secret an ocean apart, empires and merchants trading it as treasure, inventors racing to mechanize its production, and millions of enslaved and exploited people whose forced labor built vast fortunes for others while receiving none of the reward themselves. Cotton did not merely clothe civilization. It helped build the modern world as we know it, financing empires, fueling the Industrial Revolution, and reshaping the movement and fate of entire populations across oceans and continents. It is a plant that has been worshipped, weaponized, industrialized, and fought over, and it remains even now quietly present in nearly every closet on Earth. The next time you pull on a soft cotton shirt, it may be worth remembering that you are touching a thread connecting you to Mohenjo-daro's ancient weavers, to Bengal's muslin artisans, to the enslaved men and women of the American South, and to the roaring steam-powered mills of 19th century Manchester. Few materials on Earth carry so much human history woven so tightly into something so ordinary. If you enjoyed uncovering the hidden history behind everyday materials, consider subscribing for more documentary stories that reveal how ordinary objects shaped extraordinary civilizations.